Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight, let's dim the lights and drift gently backward in time. Because tonight, we're visiting a place where, quite inconveniently, time itself appeared to stop working. And naturally, the people in charge handled this with all the calm wisdom you would expect, which is to say, not especially well. So, get comfortable. If you fall asleep, that's perfect. History will wait. We're drifting back to the late 1600s, to a modest European city whose name has been mostly forgotten, which is often how cities prefer it when something embarrassing happens. This was a place of stone streets, narrow alleys, church bells, and clocks. So many clocks. Clocks in towers, clocks in churches, clocks in merchant shops, clocks in wealthy homes that chimed a little too proudly, as if they personally had invented time. Time mattered here. Markets opened at certain hours, prayers were scheduled, ships left the harbor according to bells and shadows and gears clicking away behind painted faces. The entire city ran on the shared agreement that time was reliable, predictable, obedient. And then, one morning, it simply wasn't. The day began quietly enough. A pale dawn, cool air, the kind of morning where nothing feels urgent yet. Shopkeepers lifted shutters, bakers slid bread into ovens. A watchman leaned on his spear and wondered, briefly, if he'd locked the date properly last night. He hadn't, but that wasn't the problem today. The first oddity came when the bells didn't ring. At the main church, the bell ringer pulled the rope. Nothing happened. He pulled again, still nothing. The bell hung there in dignified silence, unimpressed by human effort. Assuming the rope had snapped, he climbed the tower stairs, grumbling quietly to himself, because stairs are an insult before breakfast. The bell was intact. The mechanism was fine. The gears simply refused to move. Down the street, a merchant checked his clock. The hands were frozen. He tapped the glass. Nothing. He frowned, because tapping glass is universally believed to solve problems. Across the city, more people noticed the same thing. Clocks stuck at different times, some just after dawn, some late at night, none advancing, none retreating, all of them equally stubborn. By mid-morning, the city was buzzing with confusion, which is impressive considering no one knew what time it was. City officials were summoned, because when something breaks, the natural instinct is to find someone in a nicer hat and let them worry about it. The mayor arrived accompanied by aides who carried papers they would soon pretend were very important. He inspected a clock, then another, then a third. He frowned thoughtfully, which was the full extent of his technical expertise. Naturally, the first explanation was religious, because when machinery fails in the 17th century, it is either God, the devil, or, if one is feeling adventurous, a morally ambiguous combination of both. A priest suggested it was a sign. Of what exactly was unclear. Signs are rarely specific. They prefer to be vague and unsettling. Another official suggested sabotage. Foreign agents, perhaps. This was a popular theory, mostly because it required no evidence and blamed someone who wasn't present to argue. A clockmaker was summoned, then another, because if one expert fails, the solution is clearly more experts. They inspected gears, springs, pendulums. Everything appeared intact, clean, functional, and yet motionless. One of them quietly suggested that perhaps the problem was not the clocks. This idea was met with silence. No one liked where that thought was going. By noon, or what they assumed was noon, the city faced a problem no one had prepared for. Without time, schedules collapsed. Markets didn't know when to open or close. Laborers argued over how long they'd worked. Meals were eaten twice, or not at all. Children were sent to school and returned home immediately because no one could agree if lessons had already happened. The bells remained silent, which was deeply unsettling. Cities of this era relied on sound the way we rely on glowing screens. Without bells, the day felt unanchored, like a sentence without punctuation. The city council convened. This took a while because everyone arrived at what they believed was the correct time. The meeting began with several minutes of people accusing each other of being late. They debated solutions. One suggested resetting all the clocks at once. This was attempted. Every clock was wound, adjusted, coaxed, threatened. Nothing moved. Another proposed choosing one official timekeeper who would announce the hour manually. This lasted approximately half a day before people accused him of favoritism and lying. A philosopher, because there's always one, suggested that time was a human construct, and perhaps this was an opportunity to live more freely. He was politely ignored and later asked to stop talking. As the day, or days, passed, something strange happened. Without realizing it, the city began to slow down. Without bells telling them to hurry, people lingered. Meals stretched longer, conversations wandered. Work was done, eventually, but without urgency. Shops opened when the owner felt ready. They closed when the light faded. Appointments became suggestions, and arguments over punctuality quietly disappeared because no one could prove anything. Children played longer in the streets. Elders told stories without glancing at the sun. The city breathed differently. The elites, of course, hated this. Nobles complained that their routines were disrupted. Court meetings ran endlessly. Servants no longer rushed with the same panic. One noblewoman famously declared that her headache required medicine every 2 hours, only to discover that 2 hours had become a negotiable concept. The ruling class demanded order. Order required time. Time, inconveniently, was still missing. Engineers were brought from neighboring cities. They arrived at different times, argued about when they had arrived, and inspected the clocks with fresh disappointment. No cause could be found. Then came the rumors. Time had been stolen. Time had run out. Time had grown tired of being measured and left. One rumor claimed a traveling monk had cursed the city. Another blamed a failed alchemical experiment involving mercury and optimism. Neither explanation helped, but both were discussed at length. Weeks passed, or perhaps months. No one was entirely sure. And slowly, quietly, the city adapted. People began waking with the sun and sleeping when tired. Work was measured by tasks completed, not hours endured. Festivals stretched lazily across days. There was less rushing, less shouting, fewer apologies for being late. Time still existed, of course. The sun rose, the seasons turned, but the obsession with slicing it into neat pieces faded. Eventually, because history rarely lets peace last, one clock began to move. Just one, in a merchant's shop near the river. Its pendulum swayed, tentative at first, like it wasn't sure it was allowed to. The news spread quickly. Officials rushed in. The mayor arrived, breathless, which was ironic given the circumstances. Soon other clocks followed. One by one, gears resumed their duties. Bells rang again, startling people who had grown used to silence. Order returned. Schedules were restored. Deadlines reappeared as if they'd never left. And yet, something had changed. People remembered those strange, unmeasured days. They remembered slower mornings, longer meals, conversations without glances at clocks. The city never spoke of it officially. No records explain why time stopped or started again. The council quietly pretended nothing unusual had occurred. But some habits remained. Markets opened a little later, dinners lasted a little longer, and when a clock broke after that, no one panicked quite as much. Because once, just once, time had loosened its grip, and the city had survived. So as we drift forward or backward into our next story, remember this quiet moment in history. A reminder that time, for all its confidence, is not always in a hurry. And neither are we. Let's drift on. All right, if you're still awake, welcome back. And if you've drifted off and just resurfaced somewhere in the middle of the night, perfect. You haven't missed anything important. Time, as we've learned, is flexible like that. When the clocks finally began ticking again, the city expected relief, closure, answers perhaps. Instead, what they got was a mild, lingering irritation, Like when a long vacation ends and you're not entirely convinced real life was improved by its return. The first bell rang at what was declared to be sunrise. It echoed through the streets with an authority it had not earned. People startled. Some sighed. One baker reportedly swore at it, which felt appropriate. The city council reconvened immediately, because nothing says control restored than a meeting. They congratulated themselves on surviving a crisis they never understood. Minutes were recorded, dates were written down with confidence that bordered on arrogance. Naturally, they wanted an explanation. Clockmakers were questioned again, priests were consulted again, philosophers were regrettably invited back. None of them had anything new to say. The official conclusion, written in careful, decorative script, was that the clocks had experienced a synchronized mechanical irregularity. This phrase meant nothing, but it sounded reassuring, which is often enough. Privately, the elites tried to restore discipline. Market hours were standardized again. Workers were reminded firmly when their day should begin. Late arrivals were punished, even though everyone involved remembered a time when late had no meaning whatsoever. The nobility returned to measuring their days obsessively. Meals at precise hours, meetings timed down to the minute. One duke became so attached to his restored routine that he reportedly dismissed a servant for yawning out of schedule, because of course he did. But beneath the surface, the city was no longer the same. People still glanced at clocks, but with suspicion, as if the clocks had once betrayed them, which in a way they had. Older residents told children stories about the long day, the time when no one hurried, the time when bells were quiet and afternoons stretched like warm bread dough. Children listened with wide eyes, because to them it sounded impossible. A city without deadlines, without bedtime bells, without being told they were late. Merchants noticed something curious. Customers lingered more. They talked. They asked questions. They didn't rush out the door the second a bell rang. Work still got done, just differently. Some craftsmen quietly ignored official hours and worked by light and fatigue instead. No one complained because the results were good. Better, even. The clergy noticed changes too. Attendance fluctuated, people arrived when they arrived, prayers became longer, softer, less performative. One priest confessed, privately and with visible discomfort, that sermons felt more sincere when no one was checking the time. This admission was not shared widely. The strangest effect, though, was psychological. During the weeks without clocks, people had learned something they were never supposed to learn. That life continued without constant measurement, that urgency was often artificial, that many problems solved themselves if given enough unstructured time. And once learned, this knowledge refused to disappear. The city tried to forget. History books skipped the incident entirely. Official records jumped from one ordinary date to another, leaving a blank space in between, a tidy erasure. But memory is not a ledger. It does not care about neatness. Some residents began covering their clocks at night. Others removed them entirely from bedrooms. A few stubborn families refused to own one again. A local saying emerged, spoken quietly. Not every hour needs a name. It annoyed officials deeply. And then, inevitably, came the next problem. Because once people question time, they start questioning other things. Why must work begin so early? Why must meetings last so long? Why must meals be rushed? Why must childhood be scheduled? These questions were inconvenient, dangerous even. They were politely discouraged.
Still, they lingered. Years passed. The city aged. Generations changed. The clocks kept ticking. Mostly. Every now and then, one would stop, just for a moment. A pause. A hiccup. When that happened, People smiled instead of panicking. A stopped clock became a small rebellion, a reminder, a breath. No one ever discovered why the clocks had stopped together that first time. There were theories, of course. A shift in humidity, magnetic anomalies, divine intervention having a moment of poor communication. None satisfied. Perhaps the simplest explanation was the most unsettling. That systems humans rely on are fragile. That order is thinner than it looks. That time, when forced into gears and schedules, occasionally resists. But that's not the explanation the city chose. Officially, nothing unusual happened. Everything was normal. Everything always had been. Unofficially, people remembered. They remembered walking without rushing, eating without checking bells, living without counting. And sometimes, late at night, when the city was quiet and clocks ticked softly behind walls, someone would wake up and listen. Not to the ticking, but to the silence between ticks. Because once you notice that silence, it never quite leaves you. And with that gentle thought lingering, no urgency, no deadline, we'll drift onward soon, into another corner of history where powerful people tried very hard to control something fundamentally uncontrollable. But not just yet. For now, let the clocks keep ticking. Or don't. There's no rush. We'll continue when you're ready. All right, let's continue. No need to sit up or refocus. If your thoughts are drifting, that's perfectly acceptable here. History doesn't mind being half listened to. It's used to it. After the clocks returned and the city pretended everything was normal again, a subtle problem began to worry the people at the very top. Not loudly, not officially, but persistently. The problem was not that the clocks had stopped once. The problem was that people had discovered they could live without obsessing over it. This was inconvenient. You see, ruling classes have always loved time. They love measuring it, selling it, owning large portions of other people's time while guarding their own carefully. Time, when controlled, is power. And now the city had tasted something dangerously close to freedom. Not rebellion, not chaos, just looseness. The nobles noticed it first in their households. Servants no longer leapt into motion at the first sound of a bell. They still worked, still obeyed, but with a calm that felt suspicious. A maid would finish her task before moving on, instead of rushing halfway through 3 at once. A stable hand would pause to rest when tired, not when instructed. No one was openly defiant, which somehow made it worse. One count complained that his dinner was served whenever it was ready, as if this were a personal insult. He described the experience as unsettling. The food, he admitted reluctantly, was better. Meetings at court grew longer and less productive. Not because people talked more, but because they talked more slowly. Ideas wandered. Silences stretched. It became difficult to intimidate someone who did not seem in a hurry. The mayor, still the same man, now a little grayer and more tired, ordered a renewed emphasis on punctuality. More bells, stricter schedules, written warnings. The city complied. Outwardly. Inwardly, something had shifted. People had learned to feel time instead of obey it. Farmers noticed they worked better when they listened to weather and light rather than bells. Craftsmen found their hands steadier without constant interruption. Children, once dragged home at exact moments, lingered just a bit longer in play. None of this was revolutionary. That's what made it difficult to stop.
There was no protest to crush, no leader to arrest, just a gradual refusal to panic. The clergy attempted to restore structure through sermons. They spoke of divine order, of proper hours, of the danger of idleness. People nodded politely, then went home and ate when hungry. One priest privately admitted that confessions had changed. Fewer people confessed being late. More confessed being tired. This troubled him. The city's scholars attempted to document what had happened. They interviewed clockmakers again. They studied weather patterns from the missing weeks. They wrote careful, boring papers. None were conclusive. One scholar proposed an uncomfortable idea, that the clocks had not failed mechanically at all, that they had been maintained so precisely, so uniformly, that a small environmental shift, humidity, temperature, pressure, had affected them simultaneously. In other words, the system had been too perfect, too synchronized. This idea was quietly shelved. Perfection, after all, was something the ruling class liked to believe in. As years passed, the event faded into something like a folktale. Not officially acknowledged, but quietly remembered. Parents told children once the bells didn't ring. Children asked what happened next. Parents smiled and said, "People lived." That was usually enough. The city expanded. New buildings rose. New clocks were installed, more precise than ever. Some boasted minute hands. Others chimed quarter hours with aggressive enthusiasm. Yet the older clocks were treated differently. People maintained them carefully, but without urgency. If one stopped briefly, no one rushed to fix it. They waited, listened, let the moment be. Visitors noticed something odd about the city. It felt calm, not lazy, not inefficient, just
deals were made without pressure. Meals were not rushed. Conversations ended naturally instead of abruptly. Some visitors found this unsettling. They left quickly. Others stayed longer than planned and forgot why they had been in a hurry. The ruling families continued to intermarry, argue, inherit, and decline in the usual ways. They obsessed over lineage and legacy, completely missing the quiet cultural shift happening beneath them. They controlled land. They controlled law. But time had slipped slightly out of their hands, which, historically speaking, is often the beginning of the end for people who believe control is permanent. Not dramatically, not all at once, just slowly. One noble family famously attempted to reassert dominance by installing the largest clock tower the city had ever seen. It loomed over rooftops. Its bells rang loudly, frequently, and with unnecessary confidence. The people nicknamed it the Shouter. It broke within a year. Repairs took months. No one rushed. And when it rang again, people barely noticed. Because by then, the city had learned something deeply unfashionable. That time is useful, but it is not sacred. That schedules can help, but they are not truth. That a life measured too precisely begins to feel very small. None of this appeared in official records. History prefers wars, treaties, and dramatic failures. But this quieter lesson passed from person to person, from parent to child, from worker to apprentice. A soft inheritance. And so, as we drift further forward, or perhaps sideways, it's worth pausing here, not to mark the time, just to exist in it. Because sometimes the most radical moments in history are not loud. They do not shout. They do not demand attention. They simply slow things down and leave us changed. We'll drift onward soon. There are more stories waiting. More rulers who tried to control what cannot be controlled. More systems that quietly loosened their grip. But for now, stay here. There's nowhere else you need to be. All right, let's keep drifting. No need to adjust your pillow or check how long this has been going. That would rather miss the point. By the time a full generation had grown up after the clocks returned, the Great Pause had settled into the city's memory like a half-remembered dream. The kind you're sure was important, but can't fully explain at breakfast. The children who had once run freely through streets without bells were now adults. They worked. They married. They complained about aches they did not remember earning. And they carried with them a quiet skepticism toward urgency. They were polite about it. This was not a rebellious city. It never had been. But when someone insisted that something must be done immediately, they tended to ask, gently, "Must it?" This drove certain officials nearly to madness. The city's new leaders, sons and nephews of the previous ones, wearing the same expressions with slightly less hair, noticed that orders were followed slowly. Not refused, just absorbed first. A decree would be announced, people would read it, discuss it, finish their meal, then comply. Eventually. One magistrate described the city as chronically unalarmed. This was not meant as a compliment. Attempts were made to fix this. Schools introduced stricter schedules, timed lessons, breaks shortened. Children were taught the value of punctuality with impressive enthusiasm. The children learned the lesson. They learned how to appear punctual. But outside school, they still played till tired. They still watched the sky instead of the clock. And they grew into adults who knew the difference between timekeeping and living. The city's craftsmen guilds became quietly famous. Their work was patient, detailed, unrushed. Visitors noticed that commissions took longer than expected, but the results lasted longer too. Furniture held together. Shoes fit better. Buildings aged gracefully. When asked why things took so long, craftsmen would shrug. Because it takes that long. This answer irritated merchants from faster cities. They returned home and complained loudly about inefficiency, while secretly admiring the craftsmanship. The aristocracy, meanwhile, continued doing what aristocracies do best: marrying cousins, arguing about inheritance, spending money on unnecessary renovations. They installed newer clocks, more precise clocks, clocks that boasted of seconds now, not just minutes. Seconds, as it turned out, were deeply stressful. One noblewoman became obsessed with a clock that ticked loudly in her sitting room. She complained that it made her nervous. The clock was removed. She replaced it with a quieter one, which somehow felt worse. Eventually, she stopped keeping one in that room at all. She claimed it helped her headaches. No one argued. It became fashionable among the wealthy to speak nostalgically of simpler times. They meant earlier decades, but everyone else knew they were circling something older. The pause. No one named it directly. Naming gives power, and this was not something anyone truly wanted to control again. As the city aged, it faced wars, taxes, bad harvests, and all the usual historical inconveniences. Time did not stop these things, but it changed how people moved through them. During shortages, people shared more easily. There was less hoarding, less panic. During rebuilding, Work proceeded steadily, not heroically, just persistently. Visitors remarked that the city seemed resilient, not dramatic about hardship, not especially impressed by good fortune either. It unsettled them. One traveler wrote that the city felt out of step with the world. He did not mean this kindly, but he stayed longer than planned. The strangest thing was how little anyone talked about the clocks themselves. They were there. They worked. They rang. But they were no longer the center of life. People did not gather beneath towers to wait for bells. They did not time their days obsessively. They glanced, then decided. Historians, those who came much later, would struggle to explain this. They searched for revolutions, for reforms, for a charismatic figure who had changed everything. They found none. Just a city that had experienced time failing and noticed it could breathe. And then, quietly, history did what history always does. The city changed hands. Borders shifted. Names were altered slightly to suit new rulers. Records were lost, burned, rewritten.
All right, let's drift onward. You don't need to move. The city we've left behind will keep breathing on its own. Its clocks will tick whether anyone listens or not. Our next stop is very different. Because while one city accidentally misplaced time and survived, there were others who believed, quite sincerely, that if they could just measure everything, they could finally be safe. These were not foolish people. They were meticulous, organized, exceptionally confident in their charts, and they were terrified. We're moving forward now into the early age of modern systems, the 18th and 19th centuries, a time when empires stretched outward and inward at the same time, across oceans, into ledgers. This was the era when people began to believe that chaos was not a fact of life, but a bookkeeping error. And so, they measured. They measured land, with chains and stakes and lines drawn across fields that had never asked to be straight. They measured people, not metaphorically, literally. Heights, weights, output per hour, lifespan, productivity. They measured time with a new intensity, not just hours now, minutes, seconds, fractions of seconds. Clocks grew smaller, more portable. They followed people instead of looming over them. Time was no longer something you visited, it was something that followed you home. Factories were the purest expression of this belief. A bell rang, work began. A bell rang, work shifted. A bell rang, work ended. Not because the work was done, but because the time was. Inside these buildings, time was no longer felt, it was enforced. Owners believed this was progress. Workers felt something tightening around their ribs, though they didn't yet have language for it. Everything was scheduled. Breaks, meals, bathroom visits eventually, though this part was discussed quietly. The goal was efficiency. Efficiency, it was promised, would lead to prosperity. Prosperity would lead to happiness. Happiness, conveniently, did not need to be measured. And yet, something was missing. People noticed it in their bodies first. Exhaustion that didn't match the labor. Rest that didn't restore. A strange sense that days were passing without being lived inside. Time was moving, but it felt thin.
All right, this is the last stretch. No need to hold on to it too tightly. Endings, like time, behave better when you don't grip them. The people who measured everything never lost control all at once. That's not how it happens. What they lost, slowly, were the margins. The edges of the day, the moments too small to regulate without revealing how fragile regulation really was. It started quietly. Workers lingered after shifts, not in protest, just to talk. Someone shared food. Someone laughed longer than necessary. Lunch breaks stretched by a few minutes, then a few more. No one announced it. It simply happened. Teachers learned that lessons landed better when they ignored the bell for a moment. A story finished mattered more than punctuality. Doctors noticed patients healed better when appointments ran long, not efficiently, but humanly. Parents read just one more page and meant it. None of this appeared in policy documents. It couldn't. You can't legislate softness. The systems noticed something slipping, but couldn't name it. Productivity charts wobbled, not dramatically, just enough to cause concern. Managers added new rules. People complied, then continued as before. Because by now, many had learned something the old city once knew. Time obeyed more easily when it was treated with respect instead of fear. The obsession with measuring never disappeared. It still hasn't. Clocks kept shrinking, then glowing, then buzzing in pockets. Time became louder than ever, but so did the resistance. People began carving out spaces the clocks couldn't quite reach. Long dinners, device-free rooms, walks without destinations, Sundays that bled into Mondays. They didn't call it rebellion, they called it life. Historians again struggled. There was no single movement, no manifesto, no hero to carve in stone. Just millions of small decisions that said, not right now, not yet, this can wait. The people with too much power over time never understood why control kept slipping. They tightened schedules, people adapted. They sped things up, people slowed down elsewhere. They measured attention, people learned to drift. And so the balance shifted, not decisively, not dramatically, but enough. Enough to remind humanity of something it keeps forgetting. Time is not a container you fill, it is something you move through. You can rush through it, or you can live inside it. One day, long after the city with the silent bells had changed names and rulers again, someone wrote in a private journal, "The clock says I am late. I do not feel late. I feel here."